Dear GIIGNL members, dear colleagues and friends, good morning, good afternoon or good evening, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. I hope that you are well and that you have not been affected too much by the pandemic. The year that we have just lived through was definitely a year like no other. But before starting this presentation, I want to make a pledge to you. I will strive not to use the word unprecedented, as I think it has already been used thousands of times by industry commentators, and I will make my best efforts to keep you awake during this presentation. First of all, we would like to thank all the member companies who have provided timely information for their contribution to the report, and in particular the reviewers and the international experts who are mentioned on this slide for their comments and suggestions. This report is based essentially on data provided by GIIGNL members, which together cover 90% of LNG flows. This makes it a unique resource for the industry, and this is why your cooperation as members is essential. As always, the GIIGNL Central Office treats the information confidentially and publishes data regarding LNG voyages only on an aggregated basis at country level. So thank you again for your cooperation. Today we would like to share with you some of the key findings from the 2021 report. We will start with comments on the key figures of the year, followed by an overview of the main supply and demand dynamics. We will then zoom in on the latest developments regarding spot and short-term trade, and we will finish with a few comments on re-exports, shipping, and takeaways. You will have the opportunity to ask questions or to make comments at the end of the presentation. The global LNG imports reached 356.1 million tons, increasing by a bit more than 1 million tons or 0.4% compared with the previous year. This is much lower than 2019, which had seen an increase of 13% or about 40 million tons. In terms of countries, China has shown the highest LNG import increase among the importing countries in 2020, with plus 7.2 million tons added, or 11.7%. In 2020, global liquefaction capacity reached 454 million tons per annum, and new capacity amounted to 24 million tons per annum. 2020 was the first year since 2015 that new regasification capacity added exceeded new liquefaction capacity, with the buildup of the first wave of US projects, which is now considered as complete. 8 new regasification terminals were, with 5 of them which started commercial operations during the year. A conspicuous development was the surge in spot and short-term trade in 2020, now 40% of total trade. Spot and short-term volumes increased by 23.5 million tons and reached 142.5 million tons in 2020. So if we now look at the big picture of LNG imports last year, we see that while the demand profile of most fuels fell last year, LNG on the opposite continued to grow, although slightly. LNG demand grew by 0.4%, while in the meantime, natural gas demand declined by 2% globally. Coal declined by 4%, nuclear by 4%, and oil by 9%. So with a 0.4% growth in LNG trade, this is the 8th consecutive year of incremental growth, despite the challenges imposed by the pandemic. This is lower than the average compounded annual growth rate of the last 5 years, which was around 8%. During the year, LNG import dynamics were characterized by a lot of volatility induced by the pandemic and by seasonality. Now, from a regional perspective, Asia drove the growth of imports last year. Can we have the previous slide, please? Asia drove the growth of imports last year with a 3.4% growth rate. while imports decreased in other regions, in particular in Europe, by 5% or 4.3 million tons, and in the Americas by 2.6 million tons or minus 16.3%. Now, Europe being a residual market as opposed to Asia, Europe played an important role in balancing the market in the first half of the year. And the decrease in LNG imports in Europe further in the year was explained by lower economic activity due to the pandemic and high storage levels. Now, rising Asian demand and prices attracted more LNG cargoes to Asian countries towards the last quarter of 2020. On the supply side, we would like to highlight the following. First, the US accounted for most of the new supply volumes, plus 11 million tons of new supply volumes, driven by the commissioning of new liquefaction capacities and the ramp-up of trains which had been commissioned in 2019. Australia, Angola, Russia, and Argentina also contributed to LNG supply growth in 2020. However, Argentina stopped production from the Tango LNG facility in May 2020. Now, despite new supply additions, 2020 was also characterized by a deceleration of new LNG supply coming on stream, as well as in the number of FIDs taken. At the beginning of the year, 11 trains were expected to reach FID for more than 80 million tons per annum of new capacity, but eventually only one FID was taken in Mexico on Energía Costa Azul for 3.2 million tons per annum. The entire new liquefaction capacity added last year, 24 million tons per annum, was located in the US. 5 new large-scale liquefaction trains exported their first LNG volumes in 2020. Cameron LNG trains 2 and 3, Corpus Christi LNG train 3, and Freeport LNG trains 2 and 3. In the context of depressed LNG demand due to lower economic activity, we saw several production side adjustments which helped balance the market. The first one, of course, was the cancellations of US cargoes observed for the first time in the LNG history. A bit more than 170 cargoes were cancelled during the year between April and November. The second adjustment, there were also voluntary export curtailments for economic reasons, which were motivated by a depressed price environment. For instance, reduced production levels were observed in Egypt and in Malaysia. And third, unplanned production outages, which also contributed to balancing the market, for instance, in the USA, in Australia, and in Norway. Now, it should be noted that despite production outages and technical issues, Australia, with 77.8 million tons supplied, has taken over Qatar as leading exporter on an annual basis. On the importing side now, new regas capacity added in 2020 amounted to 26 million tons per annum. A remarkable fact is that around 20 million tons per annum of this new capacity was floating based, 4 FSRU and 1 FSU with onshore regas facilities. Floating-based terminals represented 3/4 of the new capacity added and represent a significant part of the capacity under construction. Only one new country, Myanmar, joined the ranks of importing countries last year, which brought the total number of importing countries to 43. COVID-19 has impacted the development of several regas plants under construction, notably in India, where several projects were delayed by 1 year. Total regasification capacity under construction reached 157 million tons per annum at the end of 2020, with 3/4 located in Asia. The most important capacity additions in the coming years will materialize in established markets, mainly in China, in particular in India, Kuwait, which has a big terminal under construction, and South Korea. Now, the diversity of LNG importers is also expected to increase as 5 new countries could become importers in the next 1 or 2 years, with some of them located in Africa. I will now hand over to Ekaterina for some comments on the demand dynamics. Ekaterina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vincent. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So let me provide some details on LNG imports in 2020. Last year, LNG imports increased by 1.4 million tons globally. However, different countries experienced different dynamics, as we can see on the chart. Asian countries were driving LNG imports growth, in particular China and India, who accounted together for 61% of total imports increase. As mentioned earlier, China has shown the highest increase among the importing countries, spurred by more coal to gas switching. We can remark that LNG imports grow in price-sensitive countries such as India, Kuwait, thanks to lower spot LNG prices during the first 3 quarters of the year. Also, LNG imports increased in countries with the ability to arbitrage between pipeline gas and spot LNG, such as China or Turkey. South Korea experienced a moderate growth due to temporary closures of coal plants mandated by the government in the first quarter, and during the last quarter due to the economic recovery and below average temperatures. Among Asian countries, Japan experienced the most significant decline in LNG imports due to lower demand for power generation and city gas due to the pandemic. The declines were also observed in European countries, in particular in France, Belgium, and Italy, as LNG demand was impacted by the pandemic and as storage started to be filled up towards the second quarter. Mexico showed the most important decline in LNG imports among the importing countries. The country is now less reliant on LNG imports following the start of operations of new pipelines that connect the country with US natural gas supply. Let me now look in more detail at spot and short-term LNG trade. Spot and short-term imports increased by 23.5 million tons last year. The share of spot and short-term in total LNG trade reached 40%, compared to 34% previous year. Such a significant increase can be interpreted as a sign of growing market flexibility. Spot volumes, meaning volumes delivered within 3 months from the transaction date, reached 35% of total imports. The outstanding growth of spot and short-term LNG trade can be explained by several factors. The first one is increasing flexible supply from the Atlantic basin. The second one reflects the need for some players to cope with the demand variations induced by the pandemic and seasonality. The third explanation is that countries with a high sensitivity to price increase spot LNG imports. And finally, competitive spot LNG prices encouraged arbitrage between pipeline gas and spot LNG, as in China and Turkey. Japan nominated less from its long-term contracts and took advantage of these low spot prices. Portfolio players also took advantage, buying cheap spot cargoes to honor their long-term contracts. The United States and Australia remain the leading exporters of spot and short-term LNG, accounting for 20% of spot and short-term market share each. In 2020, we saw a significant surge in spot and short-term trade. However, we wouldn't expect this trend to continue at the same pace. As the first wave of US liquefaction projects is complete, new flexible supply additions will slow down in the coming years. So now let me say a few words about re-exports. In 2020, re-export reached 2.6 million tons, showing a 1 million ton increase compared to the previous year. This is still lower than the peak of 6.4 million tons of free exports observed in 2014. Last year, the number of reloadings was low in the first half of the year, following regional price convergence. Reloadings increased with widening regional price spreads in the second half of the year. Singapore performed the largest number of reloading operations and was the main re-exporter, followed by France in terms of volumes. France seems to take the lead as a European hub for re-exports, being closer to continental gas hubs and benefiting from different supply options. China was the main destination for re-exported cargoes. A significant rise of reloaded trade was observed in the Caribbean Sea. In the region, LNG is redistributed from floating storage regasification units to smaller terminals in the region, for example, from Jamaica to Puerto Rico. Such a model can be extended for countries which don't have their own regasification, but have storage capacities. Given the significant price volatility, companies could place a higher value on storage. Let's turn now to the shipping. On the shipping side, the number of LNG carriers in operation reached 642, including 43 FSRUs and 22 LNG bunkering vessels. It should be noted that the number of LNG bunkering vessels in operation is growing. 7 out of 22 were delivered during the year. This confirms that LNG is a marine fuel that is already technically and commercially ready to help with the energy transition. Also, last year we observed the following trends. First, we see that the new shipping capacity is only keeping pace with new supply coming online, with 47 vessels delivered. In addition, logistic issues have been observed, such as congestions at the Panama Canal. It is estimated that some vessels had to wait up to 10 days to transit. Furthermore, the increase in voyage lengths and the difficulty to reposition vessels quickly from one basin to another tends to limit the flexibility of trade. As a consequence, this year inherited a tight spot shipping market. 5,970 cargoes of LNG were delivered in 2020, including re-exports, which is 68 cargoes more than the previous year. The total number of cargoes delivered since the beginning of the LNG industry exceeds 110,000. The second trend observed is related to a slight decrease in average spot charter rates. However, freight rates remain volatile. The rising share of LNG freight in the total LNG cargo cost and the volatility of charter rates are driving companies to develop hedging strategies for shipping. Looking ahead, we might wonder what about the impact of the new IMO regulations, such as EEXI, on the global LNG fleet and the impact of Qatari supply expansion on the shipping market. Let me now hand over the presentation back to Vincent.
Thank you, Ekaterina. So what can we say in conclusion? In conclusion, the global LNG market has been more resilient than other commodity markets last year, and it has been characterized by increased flexibility. Asia continues to drive demand growth, especially China, which could soon become the main LNG importer, as well as the South Asian countries. In addition, we see new pockets of demand emerging in Southeast Asia and in Latin America, although nothing comparable in terms of volume to Chinese demand. US LNG was the main contributor to the flexibility of the market and to the increase in non-long-term procurement, as well as to the balancing of the market through cargo cancellations. COVID-19 has had an impact on project development on the liquefaction side, but also on the regas side. And the low level of FIDs taken on the liquefaction side last year could mean that the market could tighten again towards the second half of the decade. However, the true impact of the pandemic remains relatively unclear. Looking ahead, of course, the energy transition and the impact of net zero targets will need to be taken into account, and they will shape the demand profile of LNG importing countries, as well as investments in new infrastructure, which we will follow closely. Thank you very much, Ekaterina and Lucia. Thank you very much all for your attention. And let's now open the floor to comments or questions. You may either open your microphone or use the raise hand button if you prefer. Or use the chat box. No particular questions. Yes. Andy?
Thank you for your overview. Fantastic results. You spoke about the congestion taking place around Panama. What is your prognosis, if I may ask, for Panama over the next 3 to 5 years?
For congestion at Panama Canal, you mean?
Yes.
Well, I think that's a very good question. Thank you, Andy. I think we should put that question to a shipping expert rather, but what we see right now is that the Panama Canal is making efforts to increase available slots for LNG carriers. There are a number of issues, including the limited availability of tugboats in the canal. A number of operational issues also last year due to weather problems. So I think that generally speaking, the Panama Canal will try to increase availability for LNG transits. But as you know, LNG is only one of the segments used of ships which use the canal. The first one and the most important one in terms of revenue for the canal being the container vessel segment. So we of course have to take this into account as well, that we are not the preferred segment, I would say, for the canal. Does anyone want to comment on this or add any particular information? Okay, I hope this answered your question, Andy.
Thank you. Yes. Yes,
Andrew.
Hi, Vincent. You should have said it was an unprecedented year last year, and it's very hard to draw that forward in terms of future forecasts. But my question is a different one for you, Vincent. You talked about 43 importing countries in your count. Would you like to give some clarification about what is and isn't included in there? Because it's there are some assumptions, I believe, that may help clarify some of the assumptions. And then if you'd like a second question, and it's up to you whether you answer this, if you'd like to perhaps compare the GIIGNL figures to others and perhaps give some clarifications as to why they may differ, because I know there's lots of different estimates out there.
Okay, yes, thanks, Andrew. Very good questions. So on the first question, on the count of importing countries, we count as importers countries who have effectively started commercial operations and have imported LNG commercially. So in 2020, we counted Egypt, even though Egypt has not imported any LNG during the year. They have exported but not imported. We did not count Russia because Russia has not started commercial operations to the best of our knowledge. And we did not count either Bahrain. Croatia is also not included since commercial operations started in January 2021. Now, there are some particularities with regard to Puerto Rico and Gibraltar. We have historically counted Gibraltar and Puerto Rico as countries, even though we should consider them rather as markets rather than countries. So they are included in the list. So depending on the source that you will take, you will see a different number, 44, 43, 42. Our number is 43. But the number of countries who actually imported LNG in 2020 was 42 because Egypt did not import during the year. And on the exporting side, if I'm not mistaken, we are at 20 since we removed Yemen from the list of exporting countries.
I would add from exporting countries, we count Argentina for 2020 because they stopped production during the year, but in 2020 they exported. And on importing side, the reason also why we counted Egypt, because the facility is still in place in Egypt. For example, in Russia, the FSRU is not in place. That's why we excluded this one from our list.
Sorry, and Andrew, I forgot your second question.
I was just going to say, ask if you had any comments on how GIIGNL's data may differ from other data sources.
Yes.
In general. I'm not looking for specifics.
Well, in general, the reason why they may differ from other sources is that a lot of sources are relying on ship tracking data only. As far as GIIGNL is concerned, we essentially rely on data submitted by members. So I would say that the bulk of the data that you see in the report are coming from the members directly, either from the terminal operators in terms of volumes, or from the importers or the traders. And we use all these submissions to cross-check data to make sure that we have the most accurate data to provide. If you use only ship tracking data, you will see that in several instances you can have double counting. You can have also cargoes which are omitted, cargoes which are considered as long-term or spot, which are wrongly reported, I would say. So we tend to think that that we add some granularity and some accuracy to the sources that you can see elsewhere in the market.
Okay, thanks, Vincent. Good answer.
Thanks, Andrew. Let's see a written question. LNG is clearly a greener fuel compared to coal. Do you see any future developments in process engineering or material science that will further drive down emissions, CO2 and CH4 from the LNG value chain to make it even more competitive in a lower carbon world? Yes, it's a good question. I think there are engineering improvements all along the chain in different segments. There are some in liquefaction already. Electric liquefaction is one of them. That's for CO2 mainly. Now for CH4, one very simple improvement is of course a reduction of venting and replacement of leaking equipment, regular leak detection and repair campaigns. So there are a lot of best practices that can be implemented along the chain to make sure that that LNG's environmental footprint is improved. On the issue of methane slip, more specifically, which is an issue which has been highlighted by many LNG opponents when it comes to the use of LNG as a fuel, the methane slip has been reduced by a factor of 4 since the 1990s, thanks to improvements in engine by the engine manufacturers. And so there is also room for improvements in that space. So yes, we see definitely improvements. Francisco, do you want to comment on that? I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, but not on that topic specifically. I think it's very interesting. But I would like to ask you about another point. Is we hear some cancellations, NG some others. Do you see any let's say contagious effect on other potential importers? And how do you see this this panorama of companies that are now quite focused on the current, let's say, European environmental landscape, and what could be the effect on the LNG imports in the future? Thanks, Vincent.
So I think, thanks, Francisco. I think you're referring specific to one contract which was reported in the press to be cancelled for environmental reasons or because the government influenced the decision. So I won't comment specifically on this case, but I think you're right to mention that that the environmental credentials of LNG imports will be increasingly scrutinized. And so you may see indeed a greater focus on that, which means that that LNG suppliers have to be more proactive in minimizing the footprints of the LNG produced and supplied to importers. And it's a fact that this will become increasingly important in the discussions between buyers and sellers. Now, you may see different requirements depending on the markets, of course. For the time being, we could think that Europe is at the forefront in terms of scrutiny on emissions. But I would say that this is a general trend. Now that many countries have announced net zero targets, Japan, China, several countries in Asia are also pursuing this path. This will be increasingly important as well. Again, if anyone wants to comment at any point, feel free to raise your hand. We don't have all the answers. You are the experts who have all the answers, so feel free to add anything. This is meant to be a forum, not only a unilateral Q&A. Any other questions? No? Okay, if not, I think we will wrap up this session. We'll be very interested to have your feedback. If you want to send us a message and let us know what we can improve for next time. We will be having another market update by the middle of the year for the 6 months of 2021. So we hope that you can also attend, and we will try to extract the key trends so that you can follow the market with the latest available data, and we'll try to digest all this for you. Okay. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you for your active participation. Thank you, Ekaterina and Lucia and Sasaki-san. And see you soon.
Thank you all.
If not physically, via Microsoft Teams. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.